June 17, 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. Oberleutnant Ernst Zimmermann stepped off the transport train into a wall of heat unlike anything he had experienced in his 28 years. The air itself seemed liquid, pressing against his skin with the weight of warm bath water, carrying scents he could not name: sweet decay, flowering vegetation, and something cooking that made his empty stomach clench with an unfamiliar longing. Around him, 240 German prisoners of war shuffled into formation under the watchful eyes of American guards. Ernst had prepared himself for this moment since his capture 3 weeks earlier in Normandy. He had steeled himself for harsh treatment, for the brutality he had been told to expect from a nation of gangsters and savages, for the deprivation that awaited prisoners of the decadent Western powers. Instead, what struck him most forcefully was the sound of laughter. Not the mocking laughter of captors, but genuine amusement coming from somewhere beyond the fence line, where civilian workers moved about with an ease that seemed at odds with a nation at war. A woman's voice called out something in a language that was not quite French, not quite anything Ernst recognized, and the words tumbled over each other like water over smooth stones. "Welcome to Louisiana, gentlemen," the American captain said, his English heavily accented with something that softened the hard edges of the words. "You'll be processed and assigned to your barracks. The rules are simple. Work hard, cause no trouble, and you'll be treated fairly." Ernst translated for the men around him, noting how many faces showed the same confusion he felt. This sprawling camp, with its neat rows of wooden buildings and the massive oaks draping Spanish moss like gray curtains, bore no resemblance to the prison facilities he had imagined. Beyond the double fence, he could see what appeared to be farmland stretching toward a line of cypress trees, their knees jutting from standing water that reflected the late afternoon sun. The processing took hours in the oppressive heat. By the time Ernst was assigned to Barracks 7, his uniform was soaked through with sweat, and the world had taken on the quality of a fever dream. The barracks themselves were simple but solid, wooden structures raised on blocks to keep them above the damp ground. Screens covered the windows, and overhead fans turned lazily, stirring air that tasted of moisture and growing things. "Herr Oberleutnant," whispered Jefferter Hans Vogel, a printer from Stuttgart who bunked beside Ernst. "The guards, they gave us soap, real soap, not that ersatz powder, and towels that are—" He paused, seeming unable to complete the thought. "Clean." Ernst examined the items distributed to each prisoner: 2 bars of white soap that smelled of nothing but cleanliness, 2 towels of substantial cotton, a toothbrush, tooth powder, a razor, and a small mirror. These were not the meager provisions of a defeated enemy, but the standard issue of an army that could afford abundance even for its prisoners. The implications of this simple distribution troubled him more than he wanted to acknowledge. That first night, sleep came fitfully in the unfamiliar heat. The sounds of Louisiana entered through the screen's insects, creating a wall of sound unlike anything in Germany. The distant splash of something large moving through water, and voices carrying on the thick air. These voices spoke that strange language again, rising and falling with a musicality that seemed at odds with the Germanic precision Ernst had known all his life. At dawn, he woke to a smell that penetrated his dreams and dragged him toward consciousness with an almost physical force. Coffee, yes, but something else: spices and meat, and a richness that made his mouth water before his eyes had fully opened. The breakfast served in the mess hall confirmed what his nose had promised: real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute that had become standard in Germany. Eggs, actual eggs, scrambled and yellow and hot. Bacon that snapped between his teeth, releasing fat and salt and flavor he had almost forgotten existed. White bread with butter, not margarine. Ernst ate mechanically, watching his fellow prisoners devour the meal with an enthusiasm that embarrassed him. He caught the eye of Feldwebel Karl Bauer, a career soldier from Munich who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. Bauer's expression was carefully neutral, but his hands trembled slightly as he spread butter on a second slice of bread. "They're fattening us for something," Bauer muttered when Ernst sat beside him. "This is a trick." But even as he spoke, Bauer ate, and Ernst recognized in his movements the same cognitive dissonance he felt in his own chest, the collision between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. The propaganda had been clear. America was a nation on the brink of collapse, unable to feed its own people, desperate and weak. This breakfast, served to prisoners, to the enemy, spoke of resources so vast that even captives could feast. The work assignments came after breakfast. Ernst, by virtue of his rank and education, he had been a mathematics instructor in Hamburg before the war, was assigned to clerical duties in the camp administration office. Other prisoners were designated for agricultural work, logging operations, and various maintenance tasks throughout the camp and surrounding areas. The Geneva Convention regulations were read aloud in German. 8 hours of labor per day. Rest on Sundays, wages of 80 cents per day in camp currency that could be spent at the canteen. 80 cents, breathed Hans beside him. For 1 day? Ernst did the calculation automatically. At current exchange rates, though, what were current rates in a world of war and chaos? This was a staggering sum for captured soldiers who should, by all rights, be grateful for gruel and survival. The implications rippled outward in his mind, disturbing the certainties he had constructed about the war, about Germany's inevitable victory, about the weakness of their enemies. The administrative office was housed in a separate building near the camp headquarters. Lieutenant Charles Arseno, the American officer supervising the clerical operations, was a man of perhaps 35 with skin tanned by constant sun and eyes that held a permanent suggestion of amusement. He spoke to Ernst in English, which Ernst understood reasonably well, but his accent transformed the words into something exotic and unfamiliar. "You'll be translating work orders, maintaining records, and helping with correspondence," Arsenault explained, gesturing to a desk already stacked with files. "My family's been in these parts since before the Revolution, the American one, that is. We're Cajun, descended from the Acadians the British expelled from Canada back in the day. You'll find Louisiana's not like the rest of America, Zimmermann. We've got our own way of doing things." Ernst nodded, uncertain how to respond. The lieutenant's casual manner, his willingness to share personal history with an enemy officer, violated everything Ernst understood about military propriety. Yet there was no weakness in it, only a different conception of what constituted appropriate behavior. The work itself was straightforward enough, translating work orders into German, ensuring that prisoner assignments were properly documented, maintaining logs of various activities. But through these documents, Ernst began to glimpse the scale of the American operation. The camp held over 3,000 prisoners at full capacity, all of them fed, clothed, housed, and put to work in a system that ran with impressive efficiency. The paperwork revealed contracts with local farmers who paid the U.S. government for prisoner labor, with the prisoners themselves receiving their portion in camp currency. It was during his 3rd day, while filing a work order for a sugarcane plantation outside town, that Ernst first encountered the true strangeness of Louisiana beyond the camp. A civilian contractor had come to collect a work detail, and Ernst was responsible for confirming the manifest. The man, middle-aged and weathered like ancient leather, spoke to him in that peculiar language Ernst had been hearing since his arrival. "I'm sorry," Ernst said carefully in English. "I don't understand." The man laughed, not unkindly, and switched to English so heavily accented it took Ernst a moment to parse. "Pardon, my friend. I forget sometimes. I was speaking Cajun French, the language my mama taught me. You speak French?" Ernst nodded. He had studied French for 6 years in school, had become reasonably proficient. The man's face brightened, and he switched to a French that was recognizable yet transformed, vintage in some ways, modern in others, peppered with words Ernst didn't know. "Etter, yes? We speak the old French here from before the Revolution, the French one, that is. Plus some Spanish, some African words, some Indian, some English, all mixed together like a good gumbo. You'll learn. Everyone learns eventually. Louisiana has a way of changing people." The man's name was Antoine Brauzard, and he owned a sugarcane plantation that had been in his family for 5 generations. He needed laborers to help with maintenance work, clearing irrigation ditches and repairing fences before the fall harvest. As he spoke, describing the work in a mixture of French and English that Ernst had to strain to follow, it became clear that Brauzard viewed the prisoners not as enemies, but as temporary workers deserving of fair treatment and adequate provision. "You boys will work hard, yes, but you'll eat well," Brauzard said, his eyes crinkling with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "My wife, she don't let nobody leave hungry. German-American don't matter to her. A man works, a man eats. That's how we do things." Ernst found himself assigned to accompany work details several times a week, serving as translator and liaison between the American guards, the prisoners, and the civilian contractors. This position, which Lieutenant Arsenault had given him almost casually, opened a window onto a world that challenged everything Ernst had believed about America and Americans. His first trip beyond the camp came on a morning when the heat was already pressing down like a heated towel, though it was barely past 8 o'clock. 20 prisoners loaded into the back of a truck, with Ernst and 2 American guards in the cab. The driver, a young corporal named Jimmy Hebert, kept up a running commentary as they drove, pointing out landmarks and sharing observations in the same easy manner that characterized all the Americans Ernst had encountered. "See that BYU there? That's BYU Lafourche, goes all the way down to the Gulf. My daddy used to take me fishing there every Sunday after Mass. You like to fish. Lieutenant Zimmermann, maybe when the war's over, you can come back, do some fishing. We got catfish big as your leg, I guarantee." The casual invitation to return to Louisiana after the war, spoken as if such a thing were the most natural assumption in the world, left Ernst momentarily speechless. In the German military, in the worldview that had been constructed around him for more than a decade, the enemy was implacable, permanent, to be defeated utterly or to perish in the attempt. The idea that one might fish with one's former enemy, that hospitality might transcend the temporary state of war, seemed almost incomprehensible. The Browsard plantation appeared as the truck rounded a bend in the red dirt road. A large house, raised on brick pillars and painted white with green shutters, sat amid massive oak trees whose branches spread like arms in benediction. Behind it, the cane fields stretched toward the horizon, the young plants already waist-high and rustling in the faint breeze. Outbuildings dotted the property barns, storage sheds, and what appeared to be worker housing. Madame Browsard emerged onto the gallery. Ernst had learned this was what Louisianans called their porches as the truck pulled up. She was a substantial woman in her 50s, wearing a print dress and an apron, her graying hair pinned up against the heat. She called something to her husband in rapid Cajun French, too fast for Ernst to follow, and Antoine responded with laughter in his voice. "My wife says it's too hot to work before you eat something," he translated. "She made breakfast for everyone. Come, come." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances, but the Americans seemed to find nothing unusual in this. They followed Antoine around to the back of the house, where tables had been set up under the oak trees. What awaited there made Ernst's breath catch in his throat. Platters of food covered the tables, scrambled eggs yellow with butter, sausages glistening with fat, rice cooked with tomatoes and spices, something called grits. That was unlike anything Ernst had seen before. Biscuits that fell apart at the touch, releasing steam and the scent of rendered pork fat, dark chicory coffee, and tall glasses of cold milk beaded with condensation. It was a feast, laid out casually, as if such abundance were unremarkable, served without ceremony to enemy soldiers who should, by rights, be grateful for survival. Madame Browsard moved among them, piling food onto plates with a firmness that brooked no refusal, speaking her mixture of French and English with animated gestures. Manges, you're too skinny, all of you. The war makes everyone skinny. Here we eat good, we work good. C'est ça." Ernst watched Hans Vogel bite into a biscuit slathered with butter and fig preserves, watched the young man's face transform with an expression that was almost painful in its intensity. Around the table, 24 German prisoners ate with the focus of men encountering not just food, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of the world. "This is propaganda," muttered Feldwebel-Bauer, even as he reached for a second helping of rice. "They're showing us this to demoralize us." But Ernst noticed how Bauer's hand trembled, how his eyes kept returning to the abundance before them with something approaching desperation. This wasn't propaganda. Propaganda was constructed, artificial, designed to deceive. This was simply how these people lived, how they treated workers and guests, and even enemies with a casual generosity that spoke of resources so vast that even sharing them created no hardship. The work that day was hard, but not brutal. They cleared irrigation ditches under the burning sun, their backs aching and their hands blistering despite the gloves provided. But every 2 hours, Madame Browsard or one of her daughters appeared with cold water, lemonade, and pieces of cake or cookies, served with the same matter-of-fact kindness that had characterized breakfast. At midday they stopped for lunch. More food, always more food. Sandwiches made with actual meat and fresh bread. Fruit that tasted of sunshine, more of that dark, sweet coffee. Ernst found himself working alongside a young prisoner named Dieter Schmidt, a farmer's son from Saxony who had been drafted at 18 and captured at 20. Dieter attacked the work with savage intensity, as if he could dig away the confusion that Ernst recognized in his own chest. "My family," Dieter said suddenly, his voice rough. "My mother and sisters, we had food tickets for everything. Bread, butter, meat when we could get it, which wasn't often. They're rationed to near starvation while we, the soldiers, got better provisions. But these people," he gestured at the Browsard house, at the fields, at the very air of abundance that surrounded them. "These people feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds its soldiers." Ernst had no answer. The observation was accurate, undeniable, and more dangerous than any battlefield wound. It was one thing to be defeated militarily, that was the fortune of war, something that could be accepted with honor. But to be defeated in this fundamental way, to have the entire edifice of propaganda and belief revealed as hollow, was a different kind of defeat entirely. Over the following weeks, Ernst's understanding of Louisiana and its people deepened in ways that left him increasingly uncertain about everything he had believed. The work details took him to different farms and plantations, each one revealing the same pattern of casual abundance and unexpected hospitality. The Cajun people, with their mixed heritage and their unique culture, seemed to exist outside the rigid categories that had structured Ernst's worldview. They were French, but not the French he had learned about, not the sophisticated Parisians who had collaborated or resisted, but rural people whose ancestors had been exiled centuries ago, who had built new lives in this strange landscape of swamps and sugarcane. They spoke a French that predated the Revolution, mixed with Spanish and African and Native American words, creating something entirely new. They were Catholic, but their Catholicism was mixed with other traditions, producing festivals and celebrations that seemed more pagan than Christian. They were American, but only technically, their loyalty running more to family and community and this particular patch of swampy earth than to any distant government. At the camp canteen, where prisoners could spend their wages on small luxuries, Ernst watched his fellow captives grapple with the same cognitive dissonance he felt. They bought Coca-Cola in glass bottles, chocolate bars wrapped in bright paper, cigarettes, magazines, toiletries, even musical instruments. The canteen was stocked like a small department store, offering goods that had become impossible to find in Germany years ago. "My wife," said Hauptmann Victor Steiner one evening, sitting beside Ernst with a bottle of Coca-Cola sweating in his hand. "She wrote me last month. She said they haven't had real coffee in 2 years. The children get 1 egg per week if they're lucky. And I sit here drinking this American sugar water, and I have to ask myself—" He paused, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Ernst understood. The question that haunted all of them, that grew louder with each day of captivity, was devastating in its simplicity. How could Germany win a war against an enemy that could afford to treat prisoners better than Germany treated its own citizens? The answer, of course, was that Germany could not win. Ernst began to understand this not through military analysis, but through the accumulation of small observations. The guards wore wristwatches, every one of them, and replaced them casually when they broke. The trucks that transported work details were new, well-maintained, and numerous enough that there always seemed to be spare vehicles. The food never varied in quality or quantity, suggesting supply chains of remarkable efficiency and depth. Even the smallest details, the quality of the paper in the forms Ernst processed, the abundance of pencils and ink, the electric fans in every building, spoke of an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could muster. It was late August when Ernst accompanied a work detail to help with preparations for a local festival. The town of Ruston was holding its annual celebration of the Feast of the Assumption, and several local farmers had requested prisoner labor to help construct temporary structures, set up tables, and prepare the grounds. The festival itself would take place on a Sunday, when the prisoners would have rest day, but the preparation work fell during the week. The festival grounds sat on the edge of town, near a small lake surrounded by cypress trees. As Ernst and his detail worked under the supervision of Corporal Hebert, local families came and went, bringing supplies and decorations. Children ran freely, their laughter cutting through the humid air. Women worked alongside men, arranging tables and hanging bunting, their easy partnership another small detail that challenged Ernst's understanding of proper social order. An elderly man approached Ernst in the late afternoon, watching him work for several moments before speaking. "You speak French?" he asked in accented English. "Un peu," Ernst replied carefully. "A little." The old man's face brightened, and he switched to a slow, clear French. "My name is Emile Dowsett. My grandfather came from Brittany in 1820. He married an Acadian girl and became Cajun just like that. You're German, yes? I fought against the Germans in the last war. Lost 2 fingers at Belleau Wood." He held up his right hand, showing where the ring and middle fingers ended at the first knuckle. "But that was a long time ago. You're not responsible for what happened to my fingers any more than I'm responsible for your capture, non?" Ernst found himself engaged in conversation with this man who had fought against Germany a generation ago, who now spoke to him with a directness that bypassed nationality and military service to address some more fundamental human connection. Emile talked about his family, about the changes he had seen in his 82 years, about the Cajun way of life and how it had persisted despite pressures to assimilate into mainstream American culture. "We remember things," Emile said, his voice soft but firm. "We remember the Grand Derangement, when the British drove our ancestors from Acadia. We remember being exiled, being strangers, being unwanted. That memory. It makes us see prisoners differently, maybe. You're far from home, just like our ancestors were. The war, it will end someday. But how we treat people, that's forever." The words stayed with Ernst long after the work detail returned to camp. He lay on his bunk that night, listening to the insects and the distant sounds of the swamp, and felt something shifting within him. It was not a sudden transformation but a gradual erosion of certainties, like water wearing away stone so slowly that the process was invisible until one day the stone simply gave way. September brought slightly cooler temperatures and a change in the work patterns as harvest season approached. Ernst found himself spending more time in the fields, where the sugarcane had grown tall and dense, rustling in the breeze with a sound like whispered secrets. The work was harder now, helping to prepare equipment and clear access roads for the coming harvest. His hands, soft from years of teaching mathematics, had developed calluses. His skin had darkened from constant sun exposure. He had lost weight, though not from deprivation. The food remained abundant, but from hard physical labor and relentless heat. It was during a work detail at the Browsard plantation in mid-September that Ernst experienced what he would later recognize as the moment of complete transformation. They were taking a break in the shade of a massive oak tree, drinking cold water that Madame Browsard had brought out in a ceramic jug. Antoine sat with them, smoking his pipe and talking about the coming harvest, about how this year looked to be a good one for sugar. "You know," Antoine said, speaking his mixture of French and English, "my grandfather worked this land as a slave before the war, the American one, the Civil War. He was freed in 1865, and somehow he managed to save enough money to buy a small piece of land. My father expanded it. I expanded it more. We went from slaves to landowners in 3 generations. Only in America, I think, could this happen. Only in Louisiana, maybe." He paused, refilling his pipe with careful attention. "This war you're fighting, it's about a lot of things I don't understand. But I know this. Any system that tells people they're better or worse because of who their grandparents were, that system is wrong. My grandfather was told he was inferior because of his skin. But he was a man like any other man. He loved his wife. He worked hard. He wanted his children to have better lives. That's what matters, Nan." Ernst sat very still, Antoine's words echoing in his mind. The Nazi ideology, the system he had served, was built on precisely the kind of racial hierarchy that Antoine was describing. Ernst had never been a fervent believer in the more extreme aspects of Nazi doctrine. He had been a mathematics teacher, not a political officer, but he had accepted it, had allowed it to become the background noise of his existence. Now, sitting under a Louisiana oak tree with a man whose grandfather had been enslaved, and who nevertheless spoke of the future with hope rather than bitterness, Ernst felt the last of his certainties crumble. That evening, back in the barracks, Ernst wrote a letter to his wife in Hamburg. He had written her regularly since his capture, carefully worded letters that passed through censorship. But this letter was different. He described Louisiana, the heat and the people and the strange, beautiful landscape. He described the abundance, the kindness of strangers, the way the Cajun people had welcomed him, not as an enemy but simply as another human being far from home. He did not write the thought that burned in his mind that Germany had been wrong, that the war was already lost, that everything they had believed was built on lies, because such words would never pass the censors. But he hoped that she would read between the lines, would understand what he could not say directly. October arrived, bringing the first hints of cooler weather and the beginning of the sugar-cane harvest. Ernst and several dozen other prisoners were assigned to help with the work, which was brutal and unrelenting. They cut cane from dawn to dusk, the sharp leaves slicing at their arms, the heat still oppressive despite the changing season. But every day they ate like kings, and every evening they returned to camp to find hot showers, clean clothes, and barracks that were cooler now as autumn advanced. The harvest festival came in late October, and the camp commandant granted permission for prisoners to attend as observers, not participants. They were transported to the festival grounds that Ernst had helped prepare, arriving in the late afternoon as the celebration was building toward its peak. What he saw there expanded his understanding of Louisiana once more. The festival was a riot of sound and color and smell. A band played strange music on accordion, fiddle, and washboard, music that was distinctly not German, not quite French, but something entirely its own. People danced with wild abandon, old and young together, their movements speaking of joy that was unrestrained by the distant war. Long tables groaned under the weight of food, enormous pots of gumbo, jambalaya, crawfish at hafe, red beans and rice, fried catfish, boudin, and dozens of other dishes Ernst had never seen before. The smells alone were intoxicating, a mixture of spices and smoke and rendered fat that made his mouth water. But what struck him most forcefully was the integration of it all. Black families and white families mingled freely, not in the rigid separation he had observed in some American cities, but with an easy familiarity that spoke of deep historical connections. Cajun French mixed with English, mixed with other languages Ernst couldn't identify. Catholics and Protestants and others celebrated together, their theological differences subsumed in the larger community identity. Lieutenant Arsenault appeared beside Ernst, carrying 2 bottles of beer. He handed one to Ernst with a grin. Against regulations, probably, but what the hell? Welcome to Louisiana. Zimmermann. This is who we are. Not perfect, understand, we've got our problems like anywhere. But we know how to live, how to celebrate, how to remember that life is more than just work and war. Ernst accepted the beer, the cold bottle slick with condensation in his hand. He watched the dancing, the eating, the celebration of simple abundance and community, and felt tears prick his eyes. This was what Germany had thrown away in pursuit of racial purity and national glory. This simple human warmth, this ability to find joy in the present moment, this fundamental understanding that people were simply people, regardless of their ancestry or language or beliefs. The war in Europe ground on through the fall and into winter. News reached the camp in fragments: the Allied advance through France, the failed German offensive in the Ardennes, the steady constriction of the Reich's borders. Ernst followed these developments with a strange detachment, recognizing each German defeat as both a military setback and a necessary step toward ending a war that should never have been fought. His fellow prisoners responded variously to the news. Some maintained defiant belief in ultimate German victory, some sank into depression, and many simply focused on the daily rhythms of work and life in Louisiana, finding in the routine an escape from larger questions they could not answer. Ernst's own transformation was complete by the time spring arrived in 1945. The lush Louisiana spring, with its explosion of flowers and warmth that was pleasant rather than oppressive, seemed to mirror his internal state. He had shed the ideology of his youth not through dramatic confrontation but through the gentle, persistent erosion of actual experience. The abundance of America, the kindness of the Cajun people, the fundamental human decency he had encountered in the most unlikely circumstances, these things had revealed the hollowness of everything he had been taught to believe. The news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Ruston on May 8, 1945. Ernst stood in the yard with several hundred other prisoners, listening to the announcement, and felt not despair but relief. The killing was over. The madness had run its course. The world could begin the long process of healing. What Ernst did not know, could not know in that moment, was how many years would pass before he could return to Germany. Repatriation was slow and complicated, prioritized by various factors beyond his understanding. He remained at Camp Ruston through 1945, through 1946, into 1947. The designation changed from prisoner of war to detained enemy alien, but his daily life remained largely unchanged. He worked, he ate, he lived in a strange limbo between his German past and an uncertain future. During these extended years, Ernst's connection to Louisiana deepened in unexpected ways. Antoine Brassard, now technically employing a civilian alien rather than a prisoner of war, offered Ernst a position as plantation manager, handling accounts and logistics. Ernst accepted, moving from the camp to a small cottage on the plantation property. He became fluent in Cajun French, learned to love crawfish boils and zydeco music, developed friendships with people who had once been his captors and were now simply his neighbors. When repatriation finally came in late 1947, Ernst faced a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. He could return to Germany, to his wife and the life he had left behind, or he could remain in Louisiana, applying for permanent residency in a country that had shown him more humanity as a prisoner than his own nation had shown its citizens. The decision in the end was not difficult. Ernst arranged for his wife to join him in Louisiana, sponsoring her immigration through a process that took nearly a year to complete. She arrived in late 1948, stepping off a train in Ruston into heat that left her gasping, just as Ernst had gasped 4 years earlier. He watched her face transform as she experienced the same revelations he had experienced, saw her understanding shift as his had shifted. They made their life in Louisiana, raising children who spoke English and Cajun French, who grew up celebrating Mardi Gras and eating gumbo, who knew their father's homeland only through stories and occasional letters. Ernst taught mathematics at the local high school for 30 years. He became a respected member of the community, known for his precise mind and his willingness to help students who struggled. He never forgot that he had come to Louisiana as an enemy, that he had been shown grace when he deserved nothing. This memory shaped how he treated others, particularly those who were outsiders or strangers, those who needed kindness more than judgment. In his retirement, Ernst often sat on his gallery in the evening, watching the sun set over the fields he had first worked as a prisoner. The transformation he had undergone from Nazi officer to American citizen, from enemy to neighbor, from certainty to wisdom, seemed both miraculous and inevitable. Louisiana had changed him, had revealed to him truths that no amount of propaganda could obscure. That abundance was more powerful than scarcity, that kindness was stronger than hatred. that human connection transcended the artificial boundaries of nation and race and ideology. He died in 1989, surrounded by children and grandchildren who bore names that mixed German and Cajun heritage, who embodied in their very existence the possibility of transformation and redemption. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, black and white, Cajun and Anglo, Catholic and Protestant, all of them mourning a man who had come to their community as an enemy and had become, through grace and time, one of their own. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.